Okay.
All right, Sparrow, we're on camera now. Oh, Sparrow, shh. Hello, my name is Sally Gardner, and I have been sent a lot of questions, which I'm about to answer. And I think Sparrow, my little dog, is going to help me. Are you? Or are you going to just be a pest? This is a question from Olivia, year 8. Where do you get your ideas from? That's a very good question. And I don't know really the answer for that. I often think of myself as having a satellite dish on my head. And I sort of pick up things as I go along. I think you get them from all over the place. I was once at a school with a little boy and he stood up and he said, "I am a story-free zone." And I thought that was such a wonderful idea that I've used it for a book that I'm writing. Because he wasn't a story-free zone. But I think so you pick up ideas all over the place. I just collect them like sweets and then I keep them. And then one day I think, oh, that's a really good idea and I think I'm going to make most of it. Question from Martina, and this is a really good question. You said that once you learn how to deal with dyslexia, it can be the most wonderful gift. Can you share with us what is most positive thing your dyslexia has given you? When I was at school, I thought the idea of dyslexia as a gift was almost laughable. To me, it was torture. I couldn't understand why I couldn't read. I couldn't understand why I couldn't do what everybody else did. But when I grew up, I discovered that I had something that other people have, but maybe haven't used as much as I did. One of the things that happened to me is because I couldn't read, I told myself stories. I told myself stories endlessly, over and over again. And I used to love the bits where I got really excited and my heart would start to race. And I could see it in my head as if it was a cinema. And I could really feel I was in the room. And wherever I was didn't matter because in my head, the cinema ran my story. And when I grew up and I began to work in theatre and then later being a children's illustrator, I realised that this really was a remarkable gift I had been given. But it took a long time for me to own it in a way. And I think for a lot of dyslexic people, the amount of lack of confidence, being put down at school, is a very hard thing to get over. And to sort of say, yeah, well actually, it's a great thing. But when you look at some of the amazing people that are out there today, and really whose work we rely on. For instance, I don't know about you, but I have an iPhone, and without that, Steve Jobs' vision for that phone and for the iPad, and without computer experts who were dyslexic, and without these visions of people who didn't fit into categories of education, wouldn't we all be a bit lost? So I think we have the ability to think outside the box, and I think that's one of the greatest ones of our gifts. Question from Dan, year 7. What is your favourite book and why? Such a good question. And I think the best part of this question is the why. Because I'm always coming back to Great Expectations, and the why am I coming back to it is the most interesting part. I think it's the most wonderful book. It starts off as one thing, it has the most terrifying opening. And you grow up with Pip, and in a way you think his life is going to take one course, as most of us do. And then it changes and something else completely unexpected happens. It is also the one book that he really developed a female role in Esther that wasn't sentimentalized, and Esther actually has a proper role. And it is a magical book. I mean, it to me is one of the greats. And I love listening to it on audio. One of the best audio recordings I heard of it was Martin Jarvis's. And if any of you want to hear it on audio, I cannot recommend that high enough. This is a question from the children at Charter Academy. How do you think of your titles for your books? Now, titles for books are very, very important, and I really spent hours and hours thinking about them. I, Coriander was not my original thought. That came from my editor, and I thought it was a very good title. But other books just take a long time. Some of them start off as one thing and then they zoom back round to something completely different. Maggot Moon came about because of the idea that it was to do with the moon landing, and maggot in Shakespearean England was the notion of an idea, and I like the two connections. So it depends what I'm feeling, but I work very hard at my titles, and yeah, I think they're incredibly important. This is a question from Rachel, and it's a very good question. How do you cope with planning your books? I want to write, but I have dyslexia and almost no education, but I am determined. So I want to tell you a story about a young man. He's got a head full of stories, and he wants to be a political journalist. In fact, he wants to be that very much indeed. But this is his education. He's been educated from 5 to 7, and then he's self-taught, and he again goes to school from 13 to 15, and after that, nothing. Now, do you think today that young man would get a job at the Times, is where he wants to be employed? And I'm afraid to say I don't think he would, which in a way would be a complete tragedy. Because this young man, with no education and a head full of stories and a life lot of experience, turns out to be Charles Dickens. So I don't think when you say, I have almost no education, that needs to be a bar. I think what is a bar to writing is not listening to story. And in a way, you do not have to be able to spell to listen. And my strongest advice to you, if you want to write, is to listen to all the classics. Just listen. Hear the beat of language. Hear the sound of the word. And when you do write, read it out loud so you can hear how it goes. You want to know the beat of your language, and in a way, listening through the ear is the best way to discover that. How do I cope with planning my books? Well, in all honesty, Rachel, I don't. I have an idea for the beginning of the book. I have a sort of vague notion where I'm going to go in the end, and the middle is a complete mystery. Question from Hannah, year 10. What advice would you give your teenage self? Yeah, that is very hard, Hannah. I think I would tell myself to love myself a little bit more, to realise I wasn't an ugly duckling, to have a bit more confidence, and never smoke. This is a question from Hannah, year 10. Hannah, you ask very good questions. If you became the Prime Minister, what would you do first? Well, what I would do first, Hannah, is I would take politicians out of education. I would just make sure the government just gave money to teachers to teach. I would also make sure there was a lot more money for people with dyslexia, and I would ban the word special needs. And for me, I think the children of our country are the most important thing. And in a way, what we need is imagination in this country. We need so much of it. It's about the one thing we have to export. And if we keep crushing our children, as I think politicians do, we will have nothing to export. So my thing is to give education back to teachers and let them do what they're trained to do, which is teach. Question from Eleanor, year 7. What advice would you give for aspiring young writers? I think the most important thing, if you want to be a writer, is reading. And that can be done through the word on the page, or it can be done through your ear. I did most of my reading, in fact I did nearly a percentage of my learning through my ear. I listened to books. And in the days of old, when knights were bold and ladies wore no knickers, reading was done very simply. It didn't have any acting put on it. And I actually quite like what I call straight reading, which is when you're just given the text with a chapter 1, da-da-da-da-da-da, because then you can make the words dance and you can decide what the character might sound like, and it becomes like a line of text. I think it's vitally important that you hear the words and you never listen to an abridged book. Every book that you wish to read should be unabridged, and then you get the full glory of it, or not, as the case may be. But there is no reason today why anyone can't be up to speed with all the classics, all the writing that's out there at the moment, with the gift of audiobook. Amelia, year 9. Hello, Amelia. Who is your inspiration and what inspired you to be a writer? I was very lucky to be taken when I was young to the theatre. I went a great deal. My mother was very keen on the theatre, and I really loved seeing story in action. And then when I began to work in the theatre myself as a designer, I was fascinated by what made story work and what made story collapse. And I think it's something that a lot of writers never get to see, because a book is a very personal experience. People read it quietly. They don't see when it becomes tediously dull. And whereas if you have an audience watching it, you can see where they are beginning to nod off and go, and I think that is very important. So for me, the theatre was perhaps my greatest inspiration and gave me the greatest love of words. Who is your inspiration? Well, I think again that's a lot of writers and people I've looked up to and thought, oh, I wonder if I could ever be as good as them. So I think I have to say other writers are my inspiration. Question from Martina. Do you have an overriding piece of advice for us parents of dyslexic children? Yes. My life was made utter misery by the fact I couldn't be tidy and I wasn't organised. Please stop making children feel terrible because they are a bit of a mess. They'll get out of it. They'll work it out. I think a lot of empowerment is when you can own something yourself and have your own agency. And maybe it drives you all a bit bonkers, but actually we do get there. And over-organising us makes life very difficult and in effect causes more stress. We're much better in the muddle we are and finding our way through it and owning our muddle and realising, well, if we don't have that on Thursday, that's going to be a problem. We will remember it. So in a way, just have patience and have faith. Your kids are going to grow up and they're going to be fine. Question from Mark. Which is your favourite book that you have written yourself? Now, it's a really difficult one, this, and I always feel very passionate about the one that is to be published. So I'm going to say it is Mr. Tiger, Betsy and the Blue Moon, which is coming out on the 4th of October, with the most fabulous illustrations by Nick Mayland. And I absolutely love this book. And it was just a pleasure to write. It was one of those books that just came easy and simple and was a joy to do from beginning to end. So I'm going to put that up as my favourite.